Hi, welcome back to the Beyond Borders International Festival at Traquair. We're just about to go into the last session, which is a discussion about the American election called the Battle for America's Soul. Really, today we've heard that Donald Trump wants to bring in a tracking system for immigrants. He's gone back to the idea of the wall, and last week he had Nigel Farage talking in support of his campaign, just when you thought things could not get any crazier in America. However, now we have Oscar Guardiola Riviera talking to William Miller, Joan, Abrahamson and Tim Phillips about the forthcoming election. We'll take you right to the 10th as we speak.
Oscar, but before I do, I just really want to thank my staff and my volunteers. I don't know, you know. We don't have a lot of money, notwithstanding the fact we live in a thing. And in actual fact, we don't take a lot of public money. Actually, much of Beyond Borders is also financed by private individuals who are committed to precisely what we say, international dialogue and cultural exchange between nations. So I want to thank all of them. They know who they are. But actually, it really is the Volunteers Weekend and my hardworking staff who work tirelessly around the year to produce these types of events and many, many more. So thank you very, very much. And hope to see you next year.
Can I ask you to join me in celebration of Mark and Catherine, because it is thanks to them, thanks to Mark and Catherine, we're here. Before moving to Great Britain, I lived in the United States, in Houston, Texas, in particular. I tell you, some of perhaps the most boring city I've ever, I've ever been. But I fell in love with it. And I fell in love with an America that I, as a Latin American, I thought I knew. And I learned that I didn't know anything about the US. So my experience in those 5 years, in between, being in Houston every day of the week and escaping to New Orleans during the weekends, out of that experience grew a book which actually brought me here to Beyond Borders back in 2010. It was cheekily titled, "What if Latin America Ruled the World?" And although the answer is incredibly simple, we would all dance better, the actual drive behind the book was this idea about the transformation of the United States. And the main thesis of the book was that the United States of America was the next Latin American country. But of course, for that to happen, serious internal rifts would occur. There would have reactions to the rise of Hispanics and so on and so forth would happen. And to my amazement, the book was published in 2010. I've seen that happening in the United States. I've followed the current presidential campaign for 2 years. I spent part of my teaching time at the University of Connecticut, teaching there, teaching mostly African American and Latino kids who have become incredibly active politically. So I really welcome this opportunity to share this panel with these three amazing, absolutely amazing, amazingly wise people. Now, they wanted to identify themselves as American concerned citizens. They are not political analysts, but every single one of them has had incredible experiences. Joan, for instance, on my right, has described herself as an expert on First Lady law. You'll see what that means. William, of course, is going to bring the experience of Beyond Borders to Santa Fe. And, given his resume, given his wonderful career, we know we're being led by the best. And you already know Tim, who, is going to become one of the protagonists of my next book. You don't know it, but you're there already. He's a peacemaker, and the art of the making of peace is something that we haven't written enough about. So, without any further ado, please join me to welcome these three wonderful, concerned American citizens. Now, of course, the first question has to be the difficult one. Who's Donald Trump?
Well, I must, in answer to that, you see why we are concerned American citizens.
Who's Donald Trump? I think he's trying to figure that out. He's in the process of flip-flopping on a number of his major positions as we speak, including offending many of his right-wing constituents by raising the question whether he's going to back off on deporting 11 million illegal aliens in the United States. So it's not clear who he is, except we know he's about self-aggrandizement. He's about himself. And it's enabled him not to worry too much about what's going on from a rigorous political standpoint. He's just who he is.
Can I add, as an add-on to that question? Does he have a chance to win? What do you think, Tim?
Well, I have to say the first thing is when previous Republican presidents were in office, I often had to apologize for them as an American citizen. But for all of you Scots, don't feel you need to apologize for Donald Trump. Just want to get that across.
He's German, incidentally.
And if you really want to make sure we take that apology, we'd be happy to take the best bottle of whiskey you can find and put it right here at the front. So, Bill Clinton, who I know and did some work with, once said, a day is a lifetime in politics. And it's always about tomorrow or the future. And for all sort of intents and purposes, if you were a political analyst, you would look and say, after 8 years of any administration, people usually want change. So, not just in theory, but in political sort of history over the last few decades, we should be having a Republican president. And I'll just be maybe a little my own sort of pragmatic assessment. I know Hillary Clinton, but we know she has a lot of, she's carrying a lot of luggage. She doesn't represent change.
Quite a few emails.
Yeah, a lot of those emails were rubbish. She doesn't represent change. She's been there for a long time. This is a change election. And it's not just a change election because we're going from 8 years of one president who for a lot of Americans was difficult to absorb, and we can talk about that later. We have Donald Trump. And it's really hard for most Americans to really understand how did Donald Trump become the nominee of the Republican Party. And I think most Republicans ask the same question. And it's really quite frightening on one level, but I also think it represents an opportunity for the American people to sort of reassert a certain moral authority as a nation, to stand up for something profoundly different.
I'd like to answer as well. First of all, Donald Trump isn't really a Republican. You know that. He isn't really a Democrat either. Donald Trump is for Donald Trump, and he is ultimately, probably fundamentally, a narcissist. So his view of the world is everything comes in, and he has an initial reaction to it, and he can't help himself from blurting it out. And he is so accustomed to being able to control the people around him, who are pretty much yes people, that he doesn't even try to control it. And he believes that he's so charming and so irresistible that people will forgive him anything he says. And the more controversial he is, the more free press he gets. So he's absolutely not troubled. So he has a few slogans: "Make America Great Again." People parody him. And in a fundamental way, the reason he does have a chance to win is that many people in America, like people in Europe, are not happy. They don't see their wages going up. They don't see their children doing better than they are. Some of their children are moving back in with them. Their children are saddled with debt, for college. Many things that were in the public domain in America, which we didn't have as much as you do, are vanished now. So it's a very troublesome time. And if we had someone like President Obama, who I think does touch the soul of America, you kind of can't help but be moved when you hear him talking. I mean, I believe that he has integrity. I believe when he speaks that he's telling the truth. That cannot be said about our two main candidates. Now, I don't think that it's because of immorality. I think it's because of a kind of character flaw, oddly enough.
If anyone in this room who followed the U.S. election, and particularly the party nominations, none of us would have forecasted Trump to emerge from 17 candidates as the Republican nominee. So can he win? You betcha. And if there's a terrorist attack on America close to the election, I think the connectivity between Obama and Clinton and the lack of difference could carry over in his strong support, at the polls during the time. So I think he's got to be taken terribly seriously. Now, what's concerning about him isn't his political views. It's his lack of attention span. The guy who wrote the book, The Art of the Deal, Ghost wrote it. Trump claims that it's his book. Well, of course, it was ghost written. Has written in the New Yorker and other places, been interviewed in the New York Times, that his attention span is something around 8 to 10 minutes. And he had a tremendously difficult time getting him to articulate what he meant by the art of the deal. And so this is nerve-wracking. But the answer is, I think he does have a chance. And I think to take him anything but deadly seriously would be a tremendous mistake. And none of us, and the other reason I say that is, since he's never had political office, since he's never really exercised social or civic responsibility, we don't know who we're getting, truthfully.
And he doesn't either.
No. But it isn't, I mean, you touch on that, William, and I want Tim to come back to this. But isn't this precisely the problem? Not only that we have not taken Trump seriously, we have not even begun to try and understand the people who are, behind him, why they are doing so. All of my journalist friends tend to dismiss that as some sort of temporary malaise. I remember, since last year, on every radio program, I was telling them, you have to take Trump seriously. He's not going to go away. And he might win in spite of the fact that the polls are now showing Hillary's ahead by a double digit. But wait a second, William, and let's allow Tim to come back.
So if I was to bet today, I would say Hillary would win. But I'm not a betting man. No. If I was to bet today, I would say she would win, because fundamentally, I think the American people, enough American people look at Donald Trump and they look at a person and say, he is not fit to be president of this nation. They may not like Hillary Clinton or vote Democratic, or traditionally could be conservative, independent, or even very conservative. But for people who I think really take the time to think and go somewhere else, maybe in their soul, and say, this person will represent our nation. And what I hope is there are more of those sort of swing voters who say, we cannot let this man be president. He doesn't have the character, and the things he has said, calling for the assassination of his opponent, all of these other things are really outrageous. And demographically, I remember after the last presidential election, people thought that the Democrats would be the presidential party and the Republicans would be the congressional party, based on the demographic shift in key states that would benefit Democrats because of the increasing population of Latinos, Asian Americans, African Americans. But as I mentioned earlier, people want change. And it's not just because we're going from an 8-year administration and therefore they want new. Like we saw here on the Brexit discussion in the UK, you know, there is a fundamental inflection shift going on in the UK, Western Europe, and the United States. I think we need a new social contract in our country. I think globalization has really hit people in ways that are profoundly disturbing. And to your question about why are people voting for Donald Trump, there's always going to be crazies. They're going to be the fringe. They're going to be the deep racists and the alternative, whatever Hillary was calling it. But here's the thing. New York Times 10 months ago had a story from a group of Princeton economists. One of them was a Nobel Prize winner. And he looked at mortality rates in the United States. And the data that shocked them the most was that middle-aged white Americans between 45 and 57, mostly working class and middle class, had higher mortality rates than African Americans and Latinos in the United States. And what's happening is they're dying from heart disease, cancer, diabetes, and suicide. So their entire social world, jobs, dignity, opportunity, the American dream that seemed to be theirs after World War II is gone. And they've been ignored. And so, as a friend of mine says, who's a brilliant psychiatrist, when people are in pain, they need somebody to blame. So Donald Trump comes along and manipulates the living hell out of these people. And he's blaming everybody else, from elites to Mexicans to you name it. You're talking about immigrants, how often they go after Syrian immigrants. The power of this beautiful musical presentation we had from a Syrian refugee to the United States, every American should see. And he's tapping into not just anger, shame and humiliation, and the lack of dignity I think a lot of these Americans feel. And I'm hoping and I'm assuming he's going to be defeated. But let me just say one thing. But we as a nation are going to, this population, particularly if he doesn't win, they're angry. And he has stoked that anger more and more. And that's the legacy and the problem we're going to have to deal with.
Joan wants
I
to
just
join.
wanted to point out one thing that hasn't been mentioned yet, which is in order for Hillary to win, people have to come out and vote for her. And it's really not a done deal that they will. A lot of people don't like Trump, but they don't really like Hillary either, and they don't trust her. And the young people who came out for Bernie and were feeling the burn and whatever, some of them are kind of disappointed, and they're like, whatever. And if people don't come out and vote for Hillary, Trump has an even better chance.
I want to insist on this point that Tim made about the importance of scapegoating. You know, this when there is pain, you need someone to blame. We just saw that working here in Britain in relation to Brexit. And you just saw someone on the panel dismissing out of hand a question that attempted to connect xenophobia with that victory. You know, this person said that, you know, it was amusing to that someone would dare to ask that question. I was this close to shout back, well, I did not find it amusing when I was racially abused for the first time since I've been in the British Islands the week after Brexit. So this is a very serious question, but therein lies the problem. The politicians keep dismissing that anger. They think it's temporary. They think he is not serious. They think so. Hence the question: how do we take it seriously?
I think I take it seriously because I think it's too easy to focus on Trump. This is much deeper than Trump. This is a rift in the American society. And as Tim points out, it really reflects a disenfranchisement an alienation from what's happening while the economy may be improving and the stock market certainly way up since the 2008 debacle. The fact is most of these people haven't been helped. I think that's exacerbated, whether intended or not by the Republican Party, to begin to appeal through the extreme right positions to almost an authoritarian personality. We don't like change, and we don't like difference. And if you protect us from that, we don't care what your policy is. It's not relevant because, frankly, the policies aren't working for us anyway, and why are we even sending you to Congress? Because you don't do anything. You know, there is no legislative thing. So I'm afraid, I could be dead wrong, and I'm certainly not an expert in this at all, but my concern is that Trump's the beginning of a series of candidates who are going to continue to represent this point of view. And it's not. So I think it's easy to get fixated on Trump because he's such an easy target. But I don't think that's the issue.
But why is the right wing being so good at capturing that spirit? We also saw, this means we need to talk about Bernie Sanders,
Yes, absolutely.
and what that represented and what happened when, by now we know that the very apparatus of the Democratic Party was rigged against him. So.
Well, we can all talk about it, but quickly with Sanders. Sanders touched the heart and soul of many, many young Americans. And it turns out that his legislative promises had about a snowball's chance in hell of being adopted. But it didn't matter. This isn't about rationality. This is about the emotional appeal of a message that Sanders produced. And it's had a profound impact because it's brought Hillary far more to the left than she would have ever been.
Absolutely.
The whole trade agreement issue, she was almost forced into while the Obama administration supports it. So I think Sanders is really important in this election. And the question that Joan raises is whether or not we can get these young people out to vote for Hillary because they don't like her.
It is, of course, very difficult, and what adds to that difficulty is the role of the mainstream media. Also, most of these kids, I've spent a lot of time with them, and they would look for their news and so on by comparing alternative media outlets on the internet and so on and so forth. They're not your usual Fox News versus CNBC person. Which means that we do have a communication problem here. You pointed out this is not about rationality, this is about emotions. What kind of emotions are we dealing with here? Or let me rephrase that question, since the title of this panel is The Battle for the Soul of America. Does America have a soul?
Of course.
I'd like to say one thing I'm sure of is Scotland has a soul.
Yeah.
I mean, it's palpable. You've been here for a week, and you feel it. And America has that also, and I think that's why so many of us really love America. I happen to be from San Francisco, and to me, it's got a strong affinity to this area, and also it's all about poetry, and it's all about the individual and community and neighborhood and all of that. I think that each of us has has a very strong relationship to our community, and in a sense, a handle on the soul of America. I feel like the people of America have kind of drifted away into a kind of selfish individualism that's like, I'll just take care of myself, and need to get back to something that is a communal experience and a sense of the country as a whole.
Yeah, I mean, when you were speaking, I thought of that line from Yeats that the best lack all conviction, while the worst are full of passionate intensity. And, we could dismiss, on one hand, depending on your perspective, the Sanders supporters and how they didn't come around to Hillary, or these people, what I would call the more normal of the rabid people behind Trump, and speak to something profound in the nation, which is people really, Americans don't do revolutions well, not since really the American Revolution. So to me, what I saw happening with Bernie Sanders and Donald Trump is how Americans do a revolution. They throw out elites. And really, I think what you're seeing is elites are being challenged on every level, at least politically, because it's easier to go after them because you have the ballot box than those who have capital. And I think what's happening is, they're next, is that a lot of Americans, you know, a friend of mine is a Democratic congressman in Massachusetts, and he tells me that when he gets off the plane, he represents an area called Worcester, it's a city. More people who have voted Democratic have said to him quietly they're going to vote for Donald Trump. And he said, why? And he says, because we have to throw everybody out. And so I think the fear is the hidden voter who's sort of embarrassed to say they're going to vote for Donald Trump, because there's nothing about Donald Trump they find appealing, a lot of these people. It's just that people want change. And there are a lot of reasons. It's not just, I think, the political class and what's happened after 2008 are center of the attention, but I do think it's the commodification of everything, from real estate to education to healthcare to housing, you name it. Everything has become unobtainable. People can't afford it. They can't access it. So the notion of, you know, the noble thing when JFK was president, you went off to public service. I mean, I heard somebody who went to the Democratic Convention who was 30 years old say, well, if I get a job, if Hillary gets elected, I'd want to go into consulting. And I said, you're disgusting. And it's just what's happened is there's this new norm, this sense of entitlement. And you see it even in friends of mine who are in venture capital, who are now in their 50s, and they worry about the generation that's coming out of business school, because it's all about a sense of entitlement. They should get rich, and therefore they're willing to take greater risk. And these are an older generation sitting in private capital and venture capital saying, we're really concerned. So I think there's a broader problem that is at the root of this anger. And it's also the concentration of wealth. And so
1%.
1%. And I think this is what we're seeing. So Donald Trump comes along. Keep in mind, there was a study recently, I think by Edsel, who said that college-educated Americans watch between 8 and 10 hours of television a week. I like to think it's news, you know, that stuff. Non-college educated Americans watch between 50 to 70 hours of television per week. And Donald Trump has been a reality TV star for the last 14 years. And news is about reality TV. So when I would watch MSNBC and CNN over the last year during the primaries, I wanted to throw my television outside the window so often, but then I wanted to watch Game of Thrones, so I kept it. And I sat there, and I was outraged because it was business on business. He knew how to play them. And they needed him because it drove ratings. And he got billions of dollars worth of free advertising.
And CNN made a ton of money.
Oh, absolutely.
And,
absolutely.
but I think that this election so far has been the ultimate reality TV.
Yeah. Which is very important, and we're going to have to go back to that, hopefully with one of the questions from the audience. But before we go to the audience, one final question. Foreign policy. With a prologue, a kind of Game of Thrones prologue. Why do we have to choose in between the lesser of two evils? As a Latino, well, you look at Hillary Clinton, her involvement in the Honduras coup, and that type of sophisticated coup has now gone everywhere. Argentina, Brazil, you name it. On the other hand, there is Donald Trump, which might look unfamiliar to many Europeans and Americans, but to us Latin Americans, well, déjà vu, another authoritarian figure. So in a sense, part of the problem here is that you are being forced to choose upon two evils.
Well, may I just say that whatever you think of the two candidates, the thought of Donald Trump is absolutely terrifying, because he believes that America should be first, America is right, what are we even talking to all of you for? I mean, do you really matter? What, you're going to have to do what we want if we just tell you what to do. This is his way of seeing. And he has mentioned, why do we have nuclear weapons if we don't use them? I'm just telling you.
I'd like to go back just for a second to this question of soul. Unfortunately, I was a philosophy major, and it kind of interests me a lot.
I knew that.
I think our soul in America is shattered. I really do. And it's shattered because we haven't had a real leader. What would Beyond Borders be without Mark? You remember John F. Kennedy? He wasn't around much, but his impact was, profound in a short time because soul is palatable, right? You feel it, as Joan said about Scotland. You feel it in a place like Santa Fe. You feel it here in the borderlands. We haven't got leaders who are articulating visions that are bringing the country together. In fact, what they're doing is allowing Congress to tear the country into separate,
Factions.
conflicting camps. So this question of soul is a real one for me. I really think it's about leadership. And I think until we have leaders who are able to inspire citizens to come together, and I think much as the First Minister, I mean, how could you not be impressed with her today? I mean, that's leadership. Her articulate point of view about the fellowship program was extraordinary. So for me, and I look at on foreign policy and on particularly nuclear weapons, which Creative Santa Fe is doing. We're doing a whole symposium on nuclear weapons in December. This is, of course, scary. Now, the American people don't have an appetite for another war. I mean, we don't want war. Nobody does. And a lot of Trump is bravado. It is not something you could take to the bank and feel good about. So you don't know where this guy is, and of course that's the scary thing. Even though Hillary is certainly going to be more to the hawkish side than Obama. And I must say, I don't think Obama has shown leadership. I've supported him. I've had Michelle Obama in my home. But he hasn't been able to capture the hearts and soul of the American people. And this is a terrible failing. And he certainly hasn't been able to unify Congress. So I'm back on this leadership thing, and I don't see it here. We don't know what had happened with Hillary as president, but we need a leader.
Tim, questions?
I mean, I agree everything you said about the earlier session, and I was telling the First Minister earlier today that 2 or 3 years ago, Mark had me go with him to the Scottish Parliament, and I spoke on this panel of the power of small nations. And there's something a friend of mine told me, who's a brilliant scientist, about when you have, he told me, a physiological change. And he says there's a difference between expansion and contraction. That when you are passionate as a person, when you are happy, when you're doing something that gives you life and energy, it's literally cellular expansion throughout the body. The opposite is contraction. When you're fearful, anxious, stressed, you pull in, you close, right? That's a fundamental human experience. And it happens to nations as well. And what I observe happening here in Scotland is, even though there's this big question, should you break away, get independent and so forth, it's tapping into a renewal of the Scottish soul, because it's about who we are as a people and can we be on our own. And that's more about expansion than contraction. I think what's happening to the American nation is about contraction. We're pulling in, and we're fearful, we're stressed, we're anxious. This isn't feeling right. And this is where true leadership, because when Nelson Mandela came out of prison, we all think back of this iconic change, but when he came out of prison, the ANC wanted payback. They wanted nationalism. They wanted people put in prison. And he said no. And I know, because we did a lot of work in South Africa, his former speechwriter wrote the speech that Mandela was going to give as soon as he stepped out of Robben Island. and he gave him the draft before he left. And he got it back with handwritten notes from Mandela. And Mandela wrote, F.W. de Klerk is an honorable man. So the speechwriter says, Madiba, comrade, you can't say that. I mean, look what you just came out of 27 years of prison, apartheid. You know, we still haven't ended it yet. He said, but he has to disprove it. That's leadership. And it's at a moment like this in the United States, and I'm sure the same here in the United Kingdom, where true leadership is needed. And FDR gave that to a nation, because we forget there were people like Father Coughlin. There was America First. I mean, FDR had a sort of shuck and jive, the Lend-Lease program, to get, ships to Churchill. And because we're in Scotland, one poem which FDR hand wrote to Churchill. He said, "O sail on, O ship o' state, sail on so fine and great. Humanity with all its fears, with all its hope for future years, rest gently upon thy fate." And I think today, the United States needs that in the reverse, to recognition that, humanity's fears for leadership, moral leadership, needs to be renewed. And I think this is the issue of the soul of our country right now.
Can we take 3 questions, and I'll give you the first word. A set of 2 questions, if you please. Over here, the 2 ladies in front.
Hi, thank you. That was an incredibly fascinating discussion, and I would just like an immediate question coming up after what you were saying about, just all that you were saying about the soul and the need for expressiveness and expansion and identity. Isn't that, my sense is that you don't think that that's what Bernie Sanders was offering to young people, whereas from here we could easily think that, like, look, he's new, he's progressive, young people love him. Why isn't he that what you're looking for?
Okay, that's one, and then over here.
Tim, everything that you have said about emotions over rationalism and looking at the US state at present seems to me to mirror what has happened here in UK with Farage in stirring up emotion over reason. And what is clear here is that nobody really truly expected Brexit, and so nobody was prepared. And actually, other than in Scotland, where we where we did have some leadership, we were at sea for a very long weekend before anyone spoke out. Have any of you, or do you think any of your statespeople, have actually addressed what happens if Trump gets in?
Remember, Farage just appeared with Donald Trump telling them about Brexit. Joan?
I just wanted to make a follow-up on the leadership question, because I think that when Trump thinks about leadership, he thinks about Putin, and he has an identification with him, and he could like to be.
Mine is bigger than yours.
Yeah, takes his shirt off and poses with a tiger and God knows what, right? That appeals to him. It makes him feel good. So the other thing is that usually in America, we have a deep bench of future leaders that are lined up. They come from all the different states. They know each other. That's what our parties do. The Democratic Party usually nurtures them, brings them along. Who's going to speak at the convention, right? That's how Clinton was discovered. All of this. But now it seems like ever since Hillary decided that she was going to be the next candidate, and that's on 2 elections now, it was like hands off the nomination. I don't want to cultivate that young Latino charismatic person from California. I don't want to cultivate this person, from Virginia. It's kind of like hands off, it's mine. And the problem with that is we haven't been cultivating those leaders and having people believe in the democratic process.
Can we address the 2 questions?
Well, I think on Sanders, the following was a lot of young people. I think Sanders' message was, we're going to give you more. We're going to give you free education. We're going to give, and incidentally, a lot of which I might personally endorse. But it was, we're going to make your lot in life better. It wasn't asking people to do something for the country, which is the Kennedy position. But I think fundamentally, those of us who have been following these campaigns closely, in my case, I am a Democrat, his programs had zero chance of ever being adopted, even if the Democrats win the Senate, which looks like they have a good shot at. So it wasn't realistic. Bernie was interesting, but from my perspective anyway, it wasn't going to fly. Programs weren't going to fly, so therefore you couldn't take him too seriously.
I mean, yeah, I mean, I think Bernie Sanders really tapped into something important, and I think he came across as authentic. And I mean, I think his policies, even the most liberal economists and others said this won't fly, even in a Democratic Congress. But it was his authenticity that really mattered. And I will say to my good friend Oscar, I mean, it's not a choice between two evils. Hillary Clinton is not an evil person. She's a deeply flawed person, like all political leaders are. She's been around a long time. And let's not forget, you know, she's a woman. And we heard the conversation earlier. There's a lot of, you know, problems with a woman being president, as there was and still is with a black man being president in the United States. And that's a real truth, and I don't think it's unique to the United States. So, I mean, if you just tally up all the beyond outrageous, almost criminal things that Donald Trump has said, has been just horrendous is not the word. It's beyond that. And I'll just say one thing that goes unspoken. But his language and rhetoric has traumatized millions of young children across the United States. I know my nonprofit has been contacted by a group in Oakland. Thousands of teachers across thousands of school districts in the United States have children coming in, Latino, African American, Asian American, you name it, deeply, deeply concerned and anxious and saying, do I need to bring a passport to show I'm an American citizen? The language they're hearing. There's a generation of children who are being traumatized because he's putting oxygen into a space for people to say the worst things imaginable, which is when you talk about the soul, I think there's an opportunity for the American people to reclaim and begin to rebuild the soul by speaking up to him, not just by saying we don't like him because he's Donald Trump, because this nation has to stand for something. And I think that's the way to defeat Donald Trump. And I think actually Hillary in the convention started to do that.
She did.
Tim is right in saying that the real evil is externalizing evil. Yep. Let us get another two questions over there.
This was alluded to earlier on, and I'm interested in what the panel would think. If you were an Islamic extremist, would you not want Donald Trump to be the President of the United States? Because he would just feed everything that they abhor and would just it'd be exactly what they want. So if I was an Islamic extremist, I probably would be planning an activity around about the election just to turn public opinion. I'd be interested in people's views on that.
And another one over here. Don't scare her.
Intimidation.
This is not a Trump rally. Go and speak up.
Yeah, you can speak up.
Get that woman out of here.
I have to confess, I know very little about the American Constitution. But Trump, from what I can see and what I've heard him say, he scares me a great deal from the point of view of the world. Assuming for a second he gets voted in and he becomes President of the United States, solely on the rhetoric that he comes out with and solely on the things that he says being so outrageous, is there anything within the American Constitution that would be able to kind of move him aside? You know, if he behaves in a way which is unacceptable to the American people and to the international community, is there anything within the Constitution which would be able to say, like, you are unfit to be president of this country?
We Latin Americans are very good at that. Even we're ruling the world even that way. Joan.
Well, I'm ashamed to say, or maybe proud to say, that the American Constitution gives very little low bar about what it takes to be president. You have to be over, what is it, 35?
35, yeah.
And
that's that.
and I think you have to be an American citizen, and that's it.
No qualifications.
No qualification. So, no on that. But I do think that it's not as though it's all over for the world if he's elected. I mean, a lot of us are developing contingency plans, of course.
I'm looking at property outside of Aberdeen.
Well, my husband's talking about New Zealand. So
I wanted to ask the First Minister if we can all come to Scotland.
Yes. But I meant contingency plans of what to do in the United States to circle the wagons and make sure that things are all right. And there are a lot of sane people who are available to go into that cabinet. One thing about Trump is he really has no people. He has no coattails. One very dear friend of mine from Los Angeles happens to have been the last winner of The Apprentice. So I've said to her, you know, if he wins, you're going in the cabinet.
I think there's a difference between striving for position. It's almost masculine conquest to win, and actually having the responsibility of running a country. And I think a lot of the rhetoric we're hearing would evaporate. I'm more concerned about the psychological profile of Donald Trump in terms of his attention span and all that. But I don't think he's trying to win this election. He'll do damn near anything, and that's been obvious from the whole primary. And he took on everybody, and he destroyed them. So I think saner heads would prevail to some extent, and I think there is no button you push for nuclear weapons. It's far more complicated than that, and I think. But I must thank all of you.
Given his attention span, he will forget the codes very quickly.
Good point. But you folks in the UK really did provide us with great comic relief by everything that happened with Brexit. I mean, I was so depressed, thinking about American politics, and suddenly there you were, Gov and Johnson and all these guys.
The whole Shakespeare thing.
Yeah, I mean, this was. Now we should learn one other thing from you. And that is, our election cycles are way too long.
Yes.
Way too long. And I think if we would adopt a system far more like the British system, we'd be a hell of a lot better off.
To your question, I've been called a lot of things, but I've never portrayed myself an Islamic radicalist. But I just read this morning that Al-Shahab had said that if Donald Trump is elected, it will be the biggest recruiting tool for them. And I can trust you that will be spread throughout the American media from the Hillary campaign and many others. But it's true. The one thing is, I actually don't think a major terrorist event will be to his benefit. I actually think it will be the opposite. Because people say, how can he protect us? Mm-hmm. And I think actually the people around Hillary Clinton and Hillary Clinton's position historically is actually tough on foreign policy would actually benefit her than him.
Yeah, but he's a better spin doctor.
Right.
So I think she is already using it in the campaign, because it's true. It's already a recruiting tool online. I think you're right that it will polarize the whole world, and some people will love that, as the ultimate Game of Thrones kind of experience, except in real life. But those of us, all of us, are going to just have to pull together, and we're going to have to use a lot of NGOs and a lot of other non-direct political means to circle the wagons and make it all right.
I believe it would be very fitting to finish this wonderful panel quoting a Mexican. a Mexican writer, the late novelist Carlos Fuentes, used to say that the US is so important, we should all in the rest of the world have the right to vote in that presidential election.
Right on.
Please join me in appreciation of these wonderful, wonderful three people, Joan, William, Tim. Thanks very much. You are amazing. William.
Thank you for telling me my story.
We have Santa Fe.